is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, breaking the cycle. A really fascinating conversation on intergenerational trauma, epigenetics, and breaking the cycle. I am speaking with Dr. Mariel Buqué. She's a Black Dominican psychologist. She received her doctorate in counseling psychology from Columbia University, where she also trained as a fellow in holistic mental health. Dr. Buqué is a world-renowned intergenerational trauma expert and the author of the book Break the Cycle, shifting from intergenerational trauma to intergenerational abundance. Her clinical framework is holistic and infuses ancient healing practices into a modern, comprehensive therapeutic approach. And about that, at some point in this conversation, I asked Mariel to demonstrate something that she uses in her work, sound healing. Dr. Buqué is widely sought out for her clinical expertise and trauma approach, and has been featured on major media outlets, including The Today Show, Good Morning America, and ABC News. What I really loved about this conversation was the part where Mariel shared her personal story. As an immigrant family, they have gone through a lot, but they also have done beautiful healing, both individually as separate members of their family and together as a family. I love her holistic approach to trauma healing. She has become a strong voice in the trauma healing community. She's one of those people who exudes light and warmth, and the moment you meet her, you fall in love with her. She has impeccable taste and fashion sense. She's a tea aficionado, and I really enjoy her Instagram reels where she shares mental health tips. Before we get to today's show, I want to recommend an old episode from our archive, my two-part interview with Mark Wallin, the author of It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. I'll have links in the show notes to Mariel's social media, her website, book, as well as anything we mention or reference in this conversation, including links to my interview with Mark Woolley. Please enjoy. Well, Mariel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Anna. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Intergenerational trauma. I would love to start by defining what it is. We've covered this on the podcast. I was thinking many years ago, I interviewed Mark Wallin when his book first came out. And somehow, even though I talk about trauma a lot, we haven't talked about intergenerational trauma per se. After those two episodes, they have been mentions, but I'm like, this is a good opportunity to revisit this topic again. And I am thinking one thought I have. Do you think all trauma is kind of intergenerational trauma? Is it wise to parse? I mean, is this a separate thing, intergenerational trauma and the trauma, or are they all merged? Where are you in your thinking?
Well, I love the question. I definitely see intergenerational trauma and trauma proper as having a lot of connections, but there being a very distinct similarity. And I think the distinction is really held in the definition itself. So it actually helps us to identify, okay, what is ancient, old, ancestral transgenerational versus what has occurred within one person's generation and their own lifetime that is more so around the category of trauma. Trauma itself has to do with the experience that people have around an event that very likely threatened their lived experience. Like it threatened their life, it threatened their sense of safety. And the fact that that has occurred has made it so that that person's internal capacity to cope was overwhelmed, and they resorted to maintaining a sense of survival mode in order to feel safe. So when we have the understanding of the fact that trauma happens in that way, we can then transition into an understanding of intergenerational trauma, which has an added element. So it's that the experience that a person has when trauma enters their life. But in addition to that, it is also something that we understand to be biological. So we understand intergenerational trauma to be transmitted biologically from parent to child by way of genetic expressions that a parent who themselves has been in trauma has held on to, and that those expressions have then, upon conception, made its way to their children and created an emotional predisposition to stress and trauma. So we have the biological side, and then we have what I call the psychological side, which is the things that happen in our lives that then create or perpetuate the trauma in our own lifetime.
Yes. So there is these two components, right? On a genetic level and on the psychological behavioral level. And as far as I remember, it can go up to 3 generations or even 7. Is that right?
It's said to be 7, and there are different areas of study or areas of scientific inquiry that have helped us to have a more robust and comprehensive understanding of the fact that we have these genetic ties or these body-based or physical ties to individuals within our lineage. And I mean, they span from, psychoneuroimmunology to cellular biology to, the science of epigenetics to psychology, right? Like there's so many points of inquiry that together they're bringing us the more comprehensive picture and framework of what are the more biological components that we can identify in individuals that are undergoing this intergenerational or transgenerational transmission of trauma. So there is a lot that is being held in science right now. And even to this day, like I receive a number of like different scientific journals, and within those scientific journals, I'm seeing like almost weekly occurrences of different areas of inquiry, really helping us to understand, okay, what is this massive web of intergenerational trauma? How can we really capture it in a way where the public can understand what we're really working with here? So it's a very exciting time to be able to be, someone who is a psychologist and a scientist in the world of intergenerational trauma, and be able to see, how much not only points of inquiry, but also the public, how much the public is really helping and hoping to understand what is happening from an intergenerational perspective.
So I think it would be good to give a bit of an example for the listener to understand. Let's say a grandmother who has experienced traumatic experience. How does that grandmother pass down the trauma through generations to their daughter? Then I believe even let's say my grandmother had trauma. I'm trying to say this the way I understood. If my grandmother had trauma before I was conceived, that trauma was already in my mom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Is understanding this correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take that example of a grandmother. So we're going to say that this grandmother was pregnant at the moment when trauma was happening and that the trauma was ongoing. We're going to say that the circumstance that was happening was that this grandmother was in domestic disputes with her partner, and that those domestic disputes, because they constitute as domestic abuse, violence, and the fact that she herself was in a state of survival mode for a prolonged period of time, that she was experiencing the hormonal flush through her body of being in a position of being a trauma and abuse survivor. So she was having the experience of chronically having elevated levels of cortisol and adrenaline and a host of different noradrenaline, right? Like a number of different types of stress hormones that were floating through her body, indicating we are in a stressed body. And that her mind was also registering the experiences that were happening around her and becoming very frozen in specific emotions, the emotion of fear, the emotion of sadness and grief around the fact that this is now her relationship. The same was happening with her nervous system. She was stuck in fight or flight, wondering when the next event would come that would actually threaten her sense of safety. So we have this pregnant grandmother that is undergoing all of these things on an ongoing basis, and that her lived experience is marked by chronic stress. Now we have the fact that she has, through her body, also a feeding of those hormones and those stress signals to her baby, which we understand from an epigenetic perspective that both the physical and the emotional gets fed to the baby in utero. And now at 5 months gestation, we understand that all of the precursor sex cells that that baby would have in their lifetime, regardless of the baby's gender, or sex, assigned sex at birth, that this baby would have carried these precursor cells, and that those precursor cells, because they're a part of this intergenerational body of grandmother, mother, and then baby, and then the precursor cells, that everybody in that body is experiencing the fact that there is a lack of safety. So now we have the full biological setup for intergenerational trauma, meaning that we have the emotional vulnerability that is situated in these three bodies because there was chronic stress. Now let's say that the baby is born, the mother is born from the grandmother, and there's still violence happening in the home. So now this baby is taking in really aggressive sounds, potentially even assuming abuse themselves. They're going into a volatile school where they're being bullied. Then they transition into their teenage and early adult life, and they engage in a toxic relationship themselves that perhaps even mirrors the relationship that they had seen growing up. And so we have really the understanding of the psychological continuation of intergenerational trauma. This baby is also in a hyper-aroused state because they have learned in their home that you embody inner chaos, and that you, in order for you to just stay alive, you have to constantly be in a state of survival. So we have the biological, we have the psychological, and when we have those two, the intersection of the two, then we can say we are looking at a person that has been in a cycle of intergenerational trauma and is the new bearer of the inheritance of trauma.
Oh, in your work, I've heard that you even look at the person's family tree. That's quite interesting as a trauma therapist, as a psychotherapist. What I also learned about you is you got your PhD from Columbia University, but you were trained as a holistic mental health professional. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because that's pretty unusual. Is this the norm now? Is it only Columbia University? What was it like? Are you the first cohort? I'm really curious about that.
Yes, it was a moment where I received a clinical fellowship of 3 years, which was a combination of a fellowship that was granted by the United States Health and Services Administration in collaboration with the Columbia University Irving Medical Center. And the two institutions collaborated to create this fellowship. I was one of the first doctoral candidates to graduate from that fellowship. And what we were aiming to do was to create a very innovative way of approaching therapeutic services. So we went with the primary understanding that within primary care settings, about 60 to 80% of the complaints that people come in with in primary care settings through their PCP, their physician, have a stress-based component or a mental health-based component. And the hospital systems across the nation were actually feeling what they call almost like an institutional conundrum or financial burden, really, even around not knowing how to service individuals that were constantly coming in either through the emergency services or through their primary care physicians for these complaints that had psychological roots. So what we did is that we created a way to actually integrate mental health services into different specialty clinics throughout the Columbia University medical system. And I was the assigned clinician that would rotate around cardiology, neurology, obstetrics. And I would, and a host of other, even primary care. I had different offices in different areas of the hospital, and I would rotate each day throughout the hospital and serve individuals that were in all of those subspecialty clinics coming in with complaints that had some sort of mental health component. And the idea was to create an innovative, holistic mental health care approach where we would integrate meditation, imagery, be able to do deep breathing and all of these different holistic and ancient and indigenous practices that we would integrate into the therapeutic services, and then work in collaboration with nutritionists, with physicians, with other team members of the clinical team to create what felt like a very holistic and well-integrated and comprehensive system of care. And that's the training that I received from the holistic perspective, which was what I then continued to do in the process of my own treatment.
What kinds of things did you pursue after your PhD? How did you enrich your knowledge base and your expertise? What other interesting things do you do that are not quote unquote traditional?
Well, I did do some of the traditional things. I became then a full-time clinician at the Columbia Medical Center. And then I was also within the medical center and within the main campus at Columbia. I was also an adjunct professor, and I was just kind of continuing the process of educating future clinicians on these practices. But on the less traditional end, I started growing in my certifications around somatic psychotherapy, which was very much a lot of how we oriented the work inside of this fellowship. In addition to that, I started trainings in different kinds of modalities of care that weren't a part of the westernized model, like sound bath meditation, which is something that I integrate a lot within my services with clients. The same with breathwork or other types of meditations or emotion freedom techniques like tapping, right? And so there were many other things that my colleagues would see as unconventional, non-traditional, and perhaps maybe even not having so much of a place in the psychological world. But what I had seen, not only through the process of my fellowship, but even thereafter, was that people that were coming in with sometimes even decades of emotional hurt and years upon years of having been in psychotherapy were feeling better quicker with a modality that felt like it was treating the whole person and really accounting for the fullness of how their pain was being contextualized in mind, body, and spirit.
What is sound bath meditation healing? Do you play an instrument? If somebody is listening for the first time, it sounds quite interesting.
I think it is. It is. So sound bath meditation actually originated thousands of years ago in Tibetan culture and Buddhist culture. And brass bowls used to be used. Now there's also crystal bowls, which are made of Earth's crystals, and they emit a sound frequency at different levels and different vibrations that are known to recalibrate the body and the mind and bring it back into a resting and calm state. So as we all know, whenever we are in a state of chronic stress, it can be really hard to bring the body back to balance. And when we're not bringing the body back to balance with frequency and we're in this hyperactive nervous system state on an ongoing basis, what can happen is that we also leave room for physical disease to burgeon, which is why an intergenerational trauma perspective that I offer also offers the perspective around how the body can create disease from the lack of ease that it has experienced for many, many decades or many generations. So what the sound bowls do is that they create these micro vibrations that help to recalibrate the body when the body is having trouble doing that on its own.
Do you have one nearby? Can you show it to me, or can you demonstrate? Is this is this hard?
It does have a technique that's associated with it, but I'm more than happy to illustrate what it can look like. I'll grab my mallet and my bowl.
Ooh, yeah.
So this is a crystal bowl. It's made of quartz crystals compressed together. And the bowl itself it comes with a mallet that actually helps to create the actual sound medicine, as we call it. So when we actually hit the bowl, it emits a sound just by making contact with the mallet. However, there's also a way in which the bowl can be further stimulated to create a very potent sound by striking the mallet in a roundabout way through the bowl. The sound may overwhelm the the microphone, so I'll just go lightly with it and see how it lands. So. Were you able to hear that okay?
Yes, it's pretty good. Yeah, I am able to hear. It's not overwhelming.
Yes. So when a person is in a room with sound bowls, you can actually hear the vibrations kind of bouncing off of the walls, and you hear the vibrations coming into your ear. And sometimes when the sounds are emitted with enough frequency and enough potency, you can feel it as it's really kind of making its way through your body. So that's why it's called a sound bath, because it bathes your body in sound and it allows for your body to recalibrate. And if people want like perhaps a little bit more of the understanding of, well, how does a body recalibrate with sound? And this can be more, I guess, better explained or seen best in water. When the sound bowl is actually placed in water and you can see the vibrations in the water, then you can see the kinds of vibrations that are also making their way onto your body. But our bodies are also made of a lot of water. So when we do any kind of sound bathing process, or the water molecules within our bodies are actually also kind of settling back into place.
Yeah, this is pretty fascinating. There is this Professor Emoto in Japan. Are you familiar with his work with the rice and the water? How it, anyways, I'll put some YouTube videos in the show notes. People can check that out. I think it's pretty cool how water responds to sound, music. They look under the microscope if it's classical music, what kind of shapes are created. Snowflake-like shapes, and when there is rock music or, kind of violent type of music, they are more disorganized, the water molecules. It's pretty fascinating.
It is. It's amazing. And I think a lot of music has the capacity to do that for us. That's why when people go to concerts or when they're in a church congregation and there's like this very potent, loud music, and there's ways in which the music is felt like in the body because there's the vibrations, that too, in addition to the fact that I believe music heals, it's just a healing, there's music therapy for a reason, right? But um, there is something that's happening on the body end that is also helping the person to feel greater calm and ease.
And at what point in a therapeutic process do you introduce the sound bowl, this bath meditation? Is it towards the end? Is it to begin the therapy session? I'm really curious about that.
I actually introduced body-based practices early on in the process of working with folks, and there is a very specific reason why I do so. When it comes to trauma-based work, we are likely to have a less productive therapeutic process or healing journey when a person feels like they're in constant nervous system overdrive and they have to constantly protect themselves. What I have seen is that when people go straight into having to tell their story, which is very often what happens in therapy, we, do a psychological evaluation, we take the history, and so we start asking a lot of questions about heavy stuff. People's nervous systems, they rapid fire, they feel on edge, and they feel a sense of having to protect themselves. There's a reason why we have so many concrete psychological defenses in the field of therapy, and those are kind of harder to break down. And it's in part because people don't feel the sense of safety in being able to really go to the depths of where they need to go. So my philosophy on this is that we first have to settle their nervous system and help them to understand how to continuously settle it on a daily basis. So a lot of what I do is also giving people homework. And sometimes I even record sound baths that have a specific set of prompts that I understand can be very helpful to that individual specifically. And I instruct them to actually engage in the sound bath on their own on a daily basis and to learn. We call it, at least in I'm also trained in dialectical behavioral therapy intensive. And so in DBT, we call, the building of a skill, building mastery, right? So building mastery around the actual nervous system regulation is going to be the primary area that we need to focus on within the work before we transition into actually concretizing what is your history, how do we get into the layers of your history. And even in my book, I follow the very same process that I do with clients. I follow the process of regulating the nervous system first and then transitioning into how we start to break down the layers of intergenerational trauma to help them to start unpacking once safety has been established in their bodies.
Are you also trained in family constellations?
I'm not trained in family constellations, but I'm very familiar with what it is. I think family constellations is something that, because it needs to be facilitated, can be really hard to replicate from the perspective of orienting people within a book. So I did consider family constellations as something that I wanted to integrate in some way. But I do believe that some work just needs to be done with facilitators and people that are, present and able to really step into those roles as they do in family constellations.
Yeah. What modalities have you experienced personally, non-traditional, that have been really useful for your own personal healing?
I do practice what I preach. So definitely the holistic methodology has been very prominent in my healing for myself, for my family, because they themselves are also cycle breakers and have been doing the work for some time. But I've been in psychodynamic work, and I have found the utility in psychodynamic work, even though it's so vastly different from the holistic area. Also manualized therapies, and then also what not too long ago was still considered to be fairly unconventional, which are some of the more somatic therapies like the EMDRs and and a prolonged exposure, and some of the therapies that in part like I have been trained to do, but I've also had the opportunity to experience myself.
And tell me a little bit about the family tree experience that you go into. How do you, and what's the reasoning behind that, and how helpful it is for people? Like I was thinking today before this interview, I'm like, wow, if I were to sit down to do my family tree, I have no clue where to begin. I don't know the people. I have really, maybe my grandparents and maybe one step before them, and that's about it. So tell me a little bit about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually guide people through a very specific intergenerational trauma tree, where we have, first of all, the understanding that we're going to add whatever information we have access to, because it can be such a daunting task to go through the generations and add so much detail. However, whatever detail there is detail that can be added and detail that we can work with. Typically, what I tend to see is that people don't have information beyond their great grandparents. And some do, but the bigger norm is for people to only have about 3 generations out. And we work with that information because even having 1 or 2 generations of information, which people definitely tend to have, can be very helpful. And the tree that I create or co-create with the individuals that I work with has a reflection of specific trauma responses that have been reflected in their family lineage, those that they have observed or those that they have heard have actually been prominent in different generations. In addition to that, I also help them to have an understanding of the different events that have transpired in their family of origin. And then we actually transition into the ways in which these actual trauma responses may have made their way into their own lives. What are the trauma responses that my client might have? A trauma response could be, to be very guarded in relationships and to not trust, right? And that lack of trust or lack of belief that a person can show up for you in a safe and nurturing way, which is really kind of the core, element of trust, could have been very, very much present in the ways that either one of their parents related to others or related to one another. And that could have been the case perhaps with a grandparent. So we start seeing the common thread of trauma responses and the ways that it made its way down the family line. In addition to this, I also integrate understandings that we have about how society perpetuates trauma, which I think is a really important part of the trauma tree process, because it's not just what happens inside of one's family unit, it's also the ways in which we live in a society that makes it so that trauma continues to burgeon inside of our families. For many of us, saying that there's someone with a mental health condition inside of our families is very taboo and is shunned upon. And if that is the case, what's going to happen is that that individual who very much needs help will never receive it because the family does not support them going outside of the family for help with a mental health condition. So when we have these ways in which society stigmatizes mental health and the ideas that are held inside of a family unit around not saying that there's mental illness in the family, that's going to further perpetuate the trauma that's inside of the family. So I also bring in that element of, the cultural piece or societal piece that I think is really critical for us to understand in the web of intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, I think that's critical, destigmatizing that mental health, destigmatizing the shame aspect of it. I was just talking to a friend the other day and she blurted out something. And I said, wow, about her sister. I said, I had no idea. And I've known this family for like 25 years. She said, oh, that's our family's big dark secret. And I thought to myself, what? That's not really like a secret material, it could be out in the open, like it's not going to affect anyone, but they kept it a secret. And people have secrets, families have secrets, my family has secrets. And I often wondered how some of the secrets, are they affecting me? Like from my paternal side, there are dark, deep secrets. It's pretty fascinating once you open this Pandora's box to learn about yourself, about your lineage. It's part of this holistic and comprehensive healing, right? Because healing cannot take place in this little isolated bubble. It's not about you. You're part of this larger picture. You're part of this family tree. I think that's such important work. I heard you say that you're very close with your family and that your parents are also doing some healing work. So the question is, a lot of people want their parents to participate in trauma work, in healing work, so that they can have a better relationship. They want to heal their relationship. We get this question so often in our community. It's a big cause of suffering when you yourself are doing some work, and you want that for your parents, but you also want them to be in your life so that you guys can have a nice relationship. It seems like you have that, and I'm wondering if you're open in sharing. How did you convince them? Were they on board to begin with? How did that happen?
Yeah, just like with any cycle breaker that's out there, the journey is not easy. So it definitely started off with there being tension pockets between myself and my sister, who I consider to be my fellow cycle breaker, probably the first one to do it in our family, because she definitely taught me a lot of things that I now hold on to as far as cycle breaking, practices. But I had to be willing to hold on to the tension that breaking cycles created between myself and my parents. And their being on board with breaking their own cycles, or more intentionally or explicitly doing so, came years after I created those tension pockets. But I had to hold on to the tension that I created firmly, even though it actually created a lot of lack of comfort for me to show up differently within my own family and allow my family to just deal with whatever discomfort it brought them to see me doing the shifting. So we basically all had to hold on to the tension in our own respective ways. Part of the reason why cycle breaking tends to maybe like be redirected, or some people just aren't able to see it fully through, is because they give into those tension pockets. They see the tension that's there. Tension causes blowups. It creates added chaos. And people are like, this isn't worth it. I'm just going to go back to the status quo, to what I know is familiar, because at least there's comfort there. There's comfort in knowing that I know what to anticipate in the familiar. The unknown is very uncomfortable for us humans, and people don't stick it out because they feel like they don't want to risk losing people in their family. They don't want to risk losing the identity that they had when they were a cycle keeper, right? When they were like in the family dynamic. There's so many points of loss in the journey of breaking cycles, and so many tension pockets that a person has to sit with, that it becomes really complex and very heavy, and people instead backtrack. But for myself and my sister, we held on, and eventually our parents started coming around more and more. And more recently, I've heard my father say to me in conversation, because of the fact that you and your sister taught me how to better express my emotions, I have greater peace in my life. And that's a beautiful thing to be able to hear a parent say almost in their 70s. Like, I believe that people feel like, cycle breaking is something that is, within a specific age range, or that we can't learn beyond certain years, or that parents themselves don't have the capacities because they're stuck in their own like ways of being. But it hasn't only been something that I've been able to witness in my own family, but that I've been able to witness in the families that I've worked with from a therapeutic perspective.
That's pretty fascinating. And so what kind of patterns have you broken with them? And let's just say that you were you born here, or Or
No, I was
no,
born
you
in
were
the
not,
Dominican
right?
Republic.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I wasn't sure if you were born here or not, but your parents immigrated, and that must have been very difficult experience to adjust to a whole new life, give their children, and the hardships that they went through. And then doing that level of work later in their life, shedding layers of yet, loss and identity. I guess when you move from one country to another, there's a lot of loss with that too, right? I know this for myself to be true. Then you regain some kind of identity. Then I'm imagining if several years later, my daughter might ask me to challenge those identities, or it's quite an interesting testament that at any age people can learn and grow and change, and it's worth it. What kinds of patterns have you broken through in your family dynamic with your parents that you can say? I mean, you don't have to be specific if you don't want to, but what are some major ones that we've broken this pattern and we're here today? Like your father now speaks about emotions, right? That's huge. How about the interpersonal dynamic between you and them? I would assume, you having grown up in the United States, very Americanized, I guess you can say, the modern generation, probably there were tensions between cultural aspects, you being a Latina and Black, this is very, very nuanced, your experience, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. It has been very layered and nuanced, as you say. And my family actually has which is not an uncommon migration history, but our history is remarkable for having had family separation due to immigration statuses. There were variable immigration statuses in our family, so we actually weren't together for 10 years. And
who wasn't with whom during those 10 years?
My father was the last to come to the US, so he wasn't with us for 10 years. And so when he arrived, he wasn't present from ages 11 to 21, so the very critical moments. And those years were very much, in essence, lost, right? In terms of his ability to parent in the ways that he desired and always thought he would, and our abilities to feel that there was the nurturance and love and protection of an added parent in the home. And also, just all the things that, financially, like things that come up with a single family household. And the reintegration of our family now with 2 adult daughters meant that my father was trying to gain back some of the experiences that he had lost. So he was hyper protective. And then he also had a little bit of that in Latinx culture, they call it like almost like machismo, caballerismo, which is like really kind of believing, to be just hyper protective of a family, right? In a way that maybe the family doesn't necessarily need. So we had to make a lot of negotiations, and there were a lot of tension pockets that came from that, not just because from an Americanized perspective, my sister and I had a different ideology about parental protection or masculine protection, but also because we were already older. In Latinx cultures, a lot of children, they exist in their parents' home well into their 30s sometimes. Transitioning out early in early adulthood was also something that required a lot of negotiation and created tension pockets. And there was a lot of education that needed to be had for my parents. And there were moments when I feared that my mother would even become depressed because she was so sad at the fact that she wouldn't have her daughters with her until their 30s, right? Or until they were married or whatever, kind of like ideas that we hold within the culture around when people transition. And so a lot of those cultural dynamics.
In comparison to the American culture, where they kick you out the moment you hit 18 or 17.
Exactly.
It's so different how at codependency, I guess, or that's a traumatic bond in some way that it's similar to my culture too. I'm Armenian. It is not uncommon for even married people. Well, now it's different to live with their parents for financial reasons, for also cultural reasons, that, you're my son, you have to live with me. And obviously there's more drama in there between the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law. There is fights. But to me, that I love all this stuff. It's juicy stuff, but please continue. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I mean it's all of that, right? Like it's in those, my parents, like many parents that have the same conundrum with their more Americanized or children of theirs that wish to transition earlier, they have to suffer a loss, right? There is a loss in their identity as a parent that has their children in their home, right? There's this like glamorization of empty nesters in the US American culture, but that doesn't fully apply to everyone. And it most certainly did not apply in our family home. And it created grief, it created tension, it created opportunities for conversation when it felt like the right time. But it was a lot of those very like nuanced, very complex moments that we had to sift through and that we had to nurture each other through, that were critical in then landing us at where we are now, which is why I always stress having conversations where everyone can have an opportunity to be able to feel heard. Because if not, the conversations can go in the other direction and just create blow-ups and experiences that sometimes are irreparable rather than leading us in the direction of what feels like a healthier kind of dynamic.
And so do your parents have their independent lives, their hobbies, their interests now that you are out of the nest? Were they able to discover who they were without you in their nest, so to speak? And what were those losses? What are they afraid of? Are they vicariously living through their children? Or is it codependency? Is this trauma bond? What is it? What is this? Have you thought about this like culturally? What is that about, that holding on to the kids?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that there is a cultural element about a parent's identity being situated in how they parent, or the fact that they are parents, rather than having also an individual understanding of who the human is that has like variable interests and an ability to be more than just a parent. For my parents now, I'll give you an example that I gathered just in the past 2 weeks. And this is my mother's, I believe, second time doing this. But she went with a couple of her friends they stayed in another state in a hotel and did activities together and had what looked like to me like a sleepover. And there has not been a single day in my mother's life where she has actually had a sleepover beyond these two instances with these women that she now is in friendship with. And the fact that I have been able to see my mother's inner child come out and experience this unhindered joy and this ability to just feel her own emotional freedom. I think that that's one of the ways in which us disrupting this idea of you must live through me, your emotions are tied to my emotions, all the patterns that you mentioned, the trauma bonding, the codependency, the reliant upon the next generation to supply one's own needs. Since all of those things had been disrupted, my mother and my father too, he has his own, ways he goes fishing. Like there's these things that he does as well. But I was able to see this beautiful joy in my mother's eyes around her being able to have a life that feels separate, but also was able to nurture the things that she was still missing.
Wow, that's really heartwarming and touching. That's incredible. And who from both of your parents was more eager or to do this cycle breaking work, your mom or your dad? I'm curious about their open-mindedness level in terms of gender, maybe, or who had more resistance, perhaps.
In my honest opinion, I believe that they both had the will and motivation, but they had different psychologies. So, and that I think if anybody is a therapist and maybe even a parent, you understand what I mean is that my dad has very different kinds of psychological resistances than my mom. There is a way in which my mom connects to her vulnerability that is different than my dad, where she is able to explore perhaps some of the ways in which she was stuck in her own cycles that would be different than my dad. My dad is also, as I see it, as like a highly sensitive person. So as am I. And there is a way in which he holds on to emotions, that is different than my mom, who I think is able to extract them and let them go with perhaps greater ease. So although there was motivation on both sides, there were different ways that we had to orient around how to have the conversations with each one of them based on what we knew about their psychology. My sister and I are both trained in psychology, so we have an added, benefit of being able to understand the mind in ways that I think our family needed, which is why, I write in a way to offer people an understanding of the mind that is very comprehensive and holistic, so that they too can have a way to apply these concepts to what they see in their home, because I think it's so critical.
And what would you say to the listener in terms of them wanting to invite their parents to this cycle breaking endeavor? I mean, is it an invitation? Is it an ultimatum? Is it done in some manipulative ways? What would be your suggestion if somebody's listening? I'm thinking of someone in my community who is a Latina, actually, and recently she opened up a little bit, and she works with her parents too. So there is like, it needs to happen. This healing needs to happen. What would you recommend to someone like that? Where to start? How to start a conversation, maybe? Because there's always that fear, right? That your parents might not be open to it. They want to choose the status quo. But your case demonstrates that, yes, this can be done, people. It can be done. So I'm loving that message. And I want people to have a sense of hope, possibility, and give them a little audacity to take that first step. What would be that first step, do you think? I mean, obviously it's different for everyone, but what would you suggest?
I love the word audacity so much because I actually call cycle breaking work courageous work, because it's exactly what it is. You have to step into daily courage to do things that are different than what you have done before. And it really starts there, right? So it first starts with recalibrating our nervous system and making sure that we're doing the work on that end. And then it starts with little microscopic moments of doing things differently. And almost, I say, treating our lives almost like a social experiment, sitting with the shift that you have created and just observing how different people respond to it. Because cycle breakers typically want to go straight into conversation with the individuals that they hope to see healing with them. And those conversations tend to start off with pointing fingers. They build psychological resistances. They lead to invalidation, and they lead to non-productive conversations that don't leave an open door for future conversations to be had. So that's what I tend to see the most happen, which is why I oftentimes urge cycle breakers to understand that when they show up differently, they send ripples of that effect to the people around them. If you show up as a more healed self, people have to respond to the version of you that is a more healed self, because that is the only way that you're choosing to show up in that moment. If you decide that you're not going to feed the cycle of, okay, this person starts yelling whenever they feel like, they're highly stressed. And when they start yelling, you feel stressed about the fact that they're yelling. So you're like, can you please stop yelling? Right? Then you're feeding the cycle. But if you instead choose to respond differently, they're also going to say, okay, she's not feeding my anger, my frustration. And that's going to already shift the dynamic. So it is about starting there. I do offer, like in my book, like a script on how people can then start the approaching process of approaching the conversation once we have that general nervous system settledness, and then a way in which the conversations can be had from a perspective that centers emotion rather than the content that people want to present. Because people get tied into the little itty bitty details of what happened and they forget that what we're really working with is a lot of emotion. We're working with shame, we're working with guilt, we're working with sadness and grief and rage and just a number of different emotions. And when we can approach conversations from the perspective of emotions, there's a possibility that more of the humanization can happen on both ends. Like, I see you as a human, I see you and your hurt. And that can lead a person to have greater compassion for the other individual that's, in that relationship dynamic, and can lead to better conversations than what we've been having.
Oh, I'm loving the sound of this. This is so aligned with how I think, and I'm loving your soft approach. What I'm also picturing in my mind, and when you said when you show up as your healed self, they respond to you differently and the ripples happen. It reminds me of that sound bath meditation. The sound starts small and then it like ripples and ripples. It feels like that to me, this whole process. And you're so right about the context and the emotions. When you parse those two elements, and it's not an easy process, obviously, right? I mean, it's easy said than done, but humanizing the other person, diving into their history, into their family tree, trauma tree, I think is so important for our own healing and the healing of the intergenerational trauma. You're doing such important work, and I love the way you deliver your message. I'm excited for your book. Can't wait for it to get my hands on it. I really admire you, and you know that most people love you. You're such a sweetheart, and I'm so delighted that you live in New Jersey, and maybe one day we can meet. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for this fantastic conversation. I will think about certain aspects of it throughout the day. Definitely, I will carry it with me in my heart.
Thank you so much. Such kind words, and I'll carry those with me. And I really appreciate you opening up space for my work and for my story. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your story.